is failing across the board to meet its 2030 sustainability goals, and the gap between wealthy and developing nations is just getting wider. From poverty to clean energy to biodiversity, not a single one of the targets agreed by UN member states in 2015 is on track, and this halfway through the agreed timeframe. Now, the report on progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, ranked 4 African countries right at the bottom 5 of all nations assessed, with South Sudan right at the bottom. The authors warn that global governance and finance needs to change and is key if the world is to ride out collective life or death challenges like climate change. Now, those questions are at the heart of a crucial global finance summit that will kick off here in Paris on Thursday. Before that, I caught up with South Africa's International Relations Minister and asked her why so many believe that there needs to be a change in global finance.
Well, I think that the focus on development has altered considerably in the last 5 years, and more particularly in the past 2 years of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Much more attention is being paid by the North to Ukraine and support for it, rather than the conflicts on the African continent or issues of development on the African continent. We've even seen a decline in aid support. There's very little mention of very terrible conflicts on the African continent, and inadequate attention to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were and are the global agenda for development.
So you think that the changes that have come about relatively in the short term, do you think that that can be shifted away from?
Well, I don't think it's merely been over the short term. I think there have been several years of not really honoring commitments. I mean, for example, one of the topics that will be focused upon in the summit is the issue of climate change and how support is provided for mitigation. Over a number of conferences of the parties, there have been commitments for funding and technology transfer. Very few of these commitments have been realized, even in terms of the promised financing, which is so necessary for countries, especially developing countries, to respond to the effects of climate change and make the necessary productive adjustments that reduce harmful emissions and modernize countries so that they're greener and cleaner. So it's been several years of, I think, of neglect and inadequate attention to really working in partnership to advance global development goals. The most stark evidence of this was seen with the vaccine response on COVID-19, where, developing countries, and particularly Africa, were at the back of the queue, and developed countries hoarded vaccines, which up to today have not been fully utilized.
How will you make sure that there is an alignment between what happens here in Paris and what's come before?
I think that's the responsibility of leaders, of the participants. What I'm pleased about with respect to the summit is that the various institutions are being drawn together. So, sometimes a summit of this nature is called, United Nations is absent, or the World Bank or the IMF. But at this summit, all of these institutions are party to the deliberations. And then how do we ensure, with respect to multilateral finance institutions, that developing countries have a real voice, that the quota that they have as part of these institutions matters and has an impact on their progress? So I would like to see, rather than a new set of debates and just a sort of talk shop, an increased attention to a coherent, coordinated set of proposals that must then be packaged by the premier multilateral institution, which we all belong to, which is the United Nations. What summits must avoid is becoming talk shops, which cause us to be wary and weary of, these constant conferences where wonderful conclusions are spoken of, beautiful, very long declarations, and yet 3 years down the line, when you look back, you actually haven't made any progress. So I'm hoping that now the urgency of making progress on development will influence concrete planning, concrete strategy, and real outcomes.